Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. As George Thorogood and the Destroyers might have sung about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, on the day they were born, the banks all gathered round. They gazed in wide wonder at the con they had found. The Speaker of the House spoke up, said, "Leave these two alone." You could tell right away they were bad to the bone. Bad to the bone. Bad to the bone. Bad to the bone. George Thorogood's got nothing on me. Stacey, what the frick is going on?
Yes, they were bad. And they are very, very bad now.
Again? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are back?
They are still in the news.
No!
And the important thing about this is, of course, we're at all-time new market highs in property and stock markets and bond markets. Everything is like soaring higher than 2007, the previous peak. And here we have a headline: Fannie and Freddie are back, bigger and badder than ever. Remember during the subprime crisis and the collapse of 2007, 2008, and they rescued the markets, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac basically went kaboom, and Hank Paulson and George W. Bush, they took over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac into conservatorship. Remember, these were government-sponsored entities. Their bonds were not supposed to be explicitly backed by the U.S. government, but in fact, once they went bust, they actually did take them over. But now, conservatorship was supposed to be temporary, a timeout, according to Mr. Hank Paulson. We were going to stabilize the company's finances, reduce their importance to the mortgage market, and figure out a better system. But nothing happened. In fact, the situation has gotten even more precarious. In the years since the crisis, private lenders, for the most part, have been willing to make mortgages if they can immediately sell them to the government agencies, mainly Fannie and Freddie. In other words, without Fannie and Freddie, there wouldn't be much of a mortgage market at all. So they're bigger and badder than ever.
That's right. It's like coming up again, you know, like a garlic pizza or something. So, yeah, there was no attempt to reform the system in any way. They just pumped more money into these buckets that have holes in the buckets. The U.S. economy, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, is a bucket with holes in it. So they just pour more water into it, you know, and they hope that this is going to solve the problem somehow. But, okay, so now they're just continuing to be a part of a structural, systemic problem that is still very much metastasizing under the surface of this planet of fraud, this
planet
of fraud that is, well, I mean, you know, they say there's no victims to these crimes, but the ecology is the victim. I mean, the reason why the humans are facing premature extinction is because of the ecosystem collapsing due to the forward sales of 100 years worth of earnings compressed to the present day to give all these guys huge bonuses.
Well, but also, you know, we put bankers in charge of markets. We make Lloyd Blankfein, we make Jamie Dimon billionaires. They're supposed to be the ones that allocate risk, that allocate capital, that are supposed to understand these things. But bankers don't want to participate in the mortgage market, which is the foundation of the American dream, according to the article. They don't want to participate in almost any market unless it's guaranteed returns, like the stock market, which, because they have a Yellen put now, they can know that things will just continue to go up. They want the taxpayer to back every single possible risk they make. So they will make loans on mortgages, but they will not actually take the risk. They transfer it to the taxpayer immediately, and that's the only way they'll make any loans, any mortgage loans, and yet the taxpayer is the one backing this for the whole time. The bankers continue to become billionaires, and the other problem is that we're stuck in these 0% interest rate world. We're stuck in housing bubbles and property bubbles around the world, excluding a large part of the population in America. They have all-time high sort of renters. All these families are having to move into rental units because they can't afford properties because, you know, the taxpayer is buying all these properties off of the, you know, the banks.
Right. Now, that the good point there is that they don't want to take risks.
They don't want to take risks.
Right. And through financial engineering, they've been able to avoid having to take risk. So whether it's Jamie Dimon or Lloyd Blankfein, they can borrow money at zero cost. They can put on any bet that they want, and the winners they keep, the losers they give back to the government. Now, how can you not become a billionaire with that kind of situation. It's like you
Exactly.
own every number on the roulette wheel. How can you lose? They
How
can't
can you
lose.
lose?
You can't, you know, they have Virtu, which is a company that's now a publicly traded company in the high-frequency trading business.
Mm-hmm.
They have 60, 70, 80, 90 straight days of profits. They don't take risks. They never take risks.
I think they had 2 days of where they didn't have profits, where they lost 2 days in like 5 years.
Yeah, because like a mouse ran into the computer one day and like they lost money for 10 seconds. But other than that, they never lose money. So if there's no risk taken by the top and all that risk is borne at the bottom, and you have this huge wealth and income disparity that you have now.
But speaking of risk, the taxpayer is taking the risk, and also by allowing the government to continue to own these entities, what you're seeing is we're stuck in a situation where we'll never be able to raise interest rates, where quantitative easing is forever. Because to make things worse, the government decided to sweep almost all of the duo's profits into its own coffers to be used as a slush fund for general government expenses. As Treasury Secretary Jacob J. Lew said in congressional testimony this spring, quote, as a practical matter, it's what has helped us reduce our overall deficit. If there is another downturn in the real estate market and Fannie and Freddie suffer losses on their some $5 trillion in outstanding securities, taxpayers will again have to foot the bill.
Yeah, they added to $5 trillion to the national debt.
$5 trillion to the Fannie and Freddie debt.
Yeah.
You still have $4 trillion on the Fed's balance sheet, so that's $9 trillion that the taxpayer is like totally oblivious to. They have no idea that they have these debts in their names, and they're going around like, woohoo, we're number one. We're number one. Maybe that's why they do USA, USA, USA.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, so the debt keeps skyrocketing, of course. As far as interest rates not being able to be raised, I mean, you know, you listen to people talk about gold because on one hand they're saying gold is down because Janet Yellen is saying interest rates are going to go up, and therefore that would give strength to the dollar and to give weakness to gold. At the same time, there's a global commodities crash. Commodities are in a 13, 14, 15-year low.
Yes.
It's the worst commodities crash in history. Not because the economy is improving and there's any threat of interest rates ever going up, because the economy around the world is collapsing and interest rates are down because of massive deflation. The only way to get out of it would be to raise rates to weed out the corrupt bankers like Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon, but since they're in the pocket of each other's pocket, playing with each other, that's never going to happen. So you have the cause for gold's flash crash, which, by the way, they sold in a single hour more gold in paper money contracts than exists above ground. Right?
Yeah, and in China they sold
gold.
some physical. So, but the fact is, you know, here we have a situation where, as we've talked about, I saw on the front page of the Financial Times, for example, that here the commodity prices are at their lowest since 2002 during the previous crash. In the global financial markets. And yet, as we showed only 2 or 3 episodes ago, stock markets continue to soar, and they've divorced themselves from commodity markets, unlike they've always been interlinked.
Right. So
if the
if the
economy is growing, you're using more commodities, and the stock market's going up. But stock markets going up are no longer based on any sort of reality. It's going down. So the Financial Times headline was along the lines of, well, Yellen's going to have a hard time raising rates if commodities are signaling that we're in a global deflationary spiral.
And if adjusted for the buybacks of stock via free money from Yellen and other central bankers, stocks are trading at 60, 70, 80 times earnings, which would be an all-time high, then there's your inflation. The hyperinflation is in stock market. It's in bond market, trading at a 300-year high. There's your hyperinflation.
And property markets, like in San Francisco, we've covered it's up well over 100% in the past 12 months. So there's a like hyperinflationary spiral going on in certain markets, which is where there's no risk.
But as we pointed out here many, many times, the economy is perfectly bifurcated in that you have engineering on the stock side with the free money, but on the wage earner side, they're not allowed to participate. They're excluded from participating.
Well, I have a
They're being
headline
vilified.
regarding that, and this is the final headline regarding construction of the property sector. Of course, you can't build property without construction workers. And here is the headline: is there a labor shortage in the construction industry? If there were a labor shortage in the construction industry, as the industry claims, we would also expect there to be healthy wage growth. Employers would be competing over a smaller pool of workers, and higher wages would attract construction workers to the firms, offering them or entice workers in different industries or occupations to switch to construction. But if we look at year-over-year wage growth for production and non-supervisory workers in the construction industry, we see that wage growth is not especially high, similar to findings for other industries. In fact, it's been declining over the past 10 years, but now the industry is claiming that there's a skills shortage. But they point out here that perhaps they're just not offering enough money. And indeed, he looks at the case of Texas, where there is a construction boom going on, but home builders in Texas found it difficult to compete with wages in the oil and gas industry, so they decided to advocate for a construction guest worker program that will lower their labor costs by bringing in workers from other countries. There's not a shortage.
Oh, you mean immigrants?
Yeah, there's not a shortage of workers.
Call Donald Trump.
There's a shortage of willingness to give them money.
Yeah.
Even though that property, by the way, the property bubble, the property sector is backed, as we said at the top of the show, by Fannie and Freddie Mac. So if the government is subsidizing that production, but the government doesn't, these same industries that are, living off the welfare of the taxpayer refuses to give some of it back to the workers in increased wages.
Right. If you're a wage earner, then you have to compete with corporations and the government who will bring labor in from any part in the world that offers competing with China, and $10 a day. Or they're actually using prison labor.
Yes, they're using prison labor like Whole Foods. They just found out that Whole Foods is using prison labor in Colorado to grow some sort of
So they've
vegetable.
engineered the destruction of any possibility of a wage earner making any wage. That wages have not gone up in 30 years, adjusted for various other parameters like inflation. They've been completely
stagnant. And they also
stagnant.
are looking for, again, Fannie and Freddie, the taxpayer, to fund all of their work, because construction employers and industry groups also increasingly push for government training programs in and outside of our education system so that they do not need to pay for on-the-job training. If employers only look for workers that meet specific credentialing or training requirements, they may pass over workers that could learn skills on the job, which was historically been a way that workers gain skills.
Right. This is what I've been saying is financial apartheid. There's a very specific wall that runs right down the middle of the economy that's engineered on one side. If you can borrow at 0% and take riskless bets and keep all the profits and throw the risk into the public domain, that's one side, and you become a billionaire. Or you're a wage earner, and suddenly you have to compete with Chinese and Malaysian and Vietnamese labor, or in prison labor, and you're considered a pariah, and you probably end up in prison, where that's the only place where you can get a meal and a job. But that's apartheid. This is the American apartheid system, which is different than previous apartheid systems, whether it's Israel, Gaza, or South Africa apartheid. This is the American apartheid. We gotta go.
Bye.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Bye. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Dr. Youssef El-Gingi. He is a GP working in Tower Hamlets, and he's the author of this excellent booklet, How to Dismantle the NHS in 10 Easy Steps. Doctor, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me on the show, Max.
Okay, we have had several shows over the past couple of years talking about the NHS, the dismantling of the NHS. So start with, I guess, the first couple of steps. What happens? How do you do it?
Yeah, so it's a long-term project, Max. We're talking about 30 years in which the NHS has been converted from a publicly funded, publicly run system, so what's called a single-payer system, into a market-based healthcare system. And I think the ultimate goal, all the evidence seems to suggest, is towards probably universal private insurance at some point in the future.
In the private sector, companies strive to become monopolies. The phone companies are buying each other to become monopolies. The various other industries are all merging. George Osborne gives them free money to merge, to become monopolies, because they want to get the cheapest prices out there in the global markets for commodities and for labor to give everybody on the inside huge amounts of cash. In the health sector, you already had a monopoly. It's called the state-run healthcare system, and they're already getting the best prices on stuff, medicine, Band-Aids, sutures, and it worked brilliantly, and the cost of administration was less than 3%. So why now, with the private sector wants to become like the NHS, a monopoly, except with all the profits going to a few bureaucrats and charlatans and banksters, are they forcing the NHS to go out there into the market and compete? Well, nobody competes in the market anymore. The market's dead. It's all monopolized now. Why is the NHS being forced to go into this crocodile cesspool at this time in history when that no longer exists?
I mean, that's absolutely the point. There is no justification for opening up a publicly run universal healthcare system It's massively favoured by the British public. It's a cherished, sacred institution. In terms of costs, you're absolutely right. It is actually the cheapest, most cost-effective way of providing healthcare, and we know that from all the data, from the international evidence. And when you compare us to European and, of course, US healthcare costs, we are significantly below them. But when, as you say, you actually introduce market forces and the private sector, contrary to the kind of mantra that we're constantly...
Right, the contractors that are being sold off bits and pieces to of the NHS, why not expose them to market forces?
Yeah.
Make them compete. Yeah. Oh, wait, no, we're not for competition with our friends, George Osborne's friends. They have a state-protected monopoly. We only want competition in this public sector where we can essentially strip all the assets, like they do in Greece. Greece is a classic example of just having bankers strip assets from a defenseless population. Here you've got people are not defending the NHS. I think one of the interesting bits about all this is that for the British population, they go into a health provider and they're not charged any money. It's free at the point of service. And so as long as they're not paying when they go in, they believe everything's great and nothing is changing. So the folks that are doing the privatization and dismantling the NHS and turning it into a 30% administrative fee, and before costs skyrocket and before healthcare goes into an American-style system where people are dead in the gurneys waiting to see a doctor and nobody gives a hoot, they just throw them in a plastic bag and dump them out back, they will not raise that price until the very end, until it's complete. It'll be too late. Then finally they'll say, oh, by the way, when you go see a doctor, it's going to cost you £30. And then people say, wait a minute, you can't do that. But by then, the 30-year process will have ended and it'll be all over.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point, is that the NHS, if you look at the Health Act, the Health and Social Care Act 2012, introduced by the Conservatives in coalition in the last Parliament, that is a privatisation act. And of course, David Cameron and the government continually deny that this is privatisation. So the NHS has been legally abolished. That's kind of the headline. But on the surface, everything appears to be the same. You still, as you say, go to your GP, you go to hospital, it's free at the point of delivery, but actually underneath, everything's being transformed. And when we talk about privatisation, people get confused because of that, the fact that things don't appear to have changed. But that is the ultimate goal, and that is actually happening. It's not that far off. So what we're seeing now is the introduction of personal health budgets, which are being rolled out to 5 million patients by 2018, and the most complex patients. And that means you'd have a pot of money. Well, you will have a pot of money. And the question is, what happens when that pot of money runs out? Well, easy, you top it up. Of course, not so easy if you don't have the money. And so that introduces co-payments and insurance. And we're now seeing also the devolution of, as I'm sure you know, with Manchester, the devolution of health and social care spending to regional control. That's being rolled out to other places like Cornwall. So the point of that is that health care is going to go in the same direction that social care went, which is being privatised and then means tested. And in fact, that's what David Cameron's main health advisor is on the record as saying. He wrote an article in The Telegraph a few years ago where he said that essentially these new local NHS bodies, the CCGs, should merge with insurance companies, and that those who can pay should contribute to their own care.
So healthcare, I believe it's the biggest component of the UK economy, roughly 10%. So that would be £140 billion or so of the UK output, GDP, is healthcare. It's the single biggest component. It's therefore the piñata, the biggest piñata to crash and smash for all the candy that drops out. That's the income is going to go typically to foreign pension owners. Like they sold the rail system, they sell Eurostar, they sell the Royal Mail, they sell parts of the NHS. They sell to German government, who then puts those assets into the retirement accounts of Germans who are sitting on the beach somewhere having a great retirement because David Cameron says, we can't afford to allow these assets to be enjoyed by our UK population in retirement. We want you to not have health care, and we're going to make you work until you drop dead so that we can give German retirees a big fat retirement. They can sit on the beach and take all the best spots on the beach, and the British people are, barely able to afford a decent bikini.
So if you take something that obviously you're well aware of, like PFI, That's a classic example of a situation where you've got kind of a captive public sector that is just, the wealth is just being sucked out and extracted out of that. And up and down the country, you've got tens of trusts. In fact, over 100 hospitals that were built with PFI. And I know that my local hospital, the biggest one in the country, in Bart's Health, Tower Hamlets, that's got the largest PFI. They're having to pay something like £2 million in interest a week.
How come the healthcare professionals in this country who make a living wage or make a good wage, maybe £100,000, in the system, how come they're vilified by the BBC and other media outlets as being in some way ripping the system off? And that we should instead give it to a banker who's making 20, 30, 40 million pounds a year as a rentier, scraping cash off the top and not contributing anything. How did that mindset happen? How did the outlets like the BBC get it in their head that making money in health is evil, but being a private banker, a private equity banker, is glorious?
Yeah, I mean, I think the NHS is not an isolated issue. As you know, this is part of a much bigger project of neoliberalism, of privatization, deregulation, financialization, deunionization, which has been going on obviously since the late 70s, early 80s, and that applies to every sector. And something like PFI is the use of complex financial instruments in public services and in every sector.
One of the problems that I've noticed in this country is that British people lack self-respect. So what I mean by this is that the average British person has this concept of money well spent, or they wouldn't, for example, the British people won't want to spend another £1 or £2 a month to get decent broadband. They don't consider that value for money because they don't have any self-respect in a lot of ways. They're happy being second-class citizens in the digital world. In the healthcare arena, let's face it, British people, on the most part, they like to drink. They like to drink excessively, and that's their values. Having good health care, that doesn't seem part of their value system because they don't have that self-respect. People who feel like, I don't really need health care, I'm not worth it. Why should I even care? I just wanted my bottle of gin and leave me alone. So how do you educate the population to care enough about themselves to want decent health care?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very tricky, difficult question, isn't it? I mean, when you're looking at some of these lifestyle issues, which of course the tabloids love to kind of focus on, such as smokers or obesity, there are, these are multifactorial issues. And I was at a Spectator NHS debate pre-election, and obviously the general consensus from the audience was, people need to just look after themselves.
No, but I see it right here in this building. You've got Terra Firma, which is a private equity firm run by Guy Hans. The people who work there have no self-respect either. They're not healthy. They're in very bad health because they have no concept of self-respect.
But this comes down to something called the social determinants of health, Max, as I'm sure you know. So we know that socioeconomic deprivation is linked to, to worse health outcomes. You're more likely to drink, you're more likely to smoke, you're more likely to have mental illness, more likely to die prematurely, to have, comorbidities, long-term conditions if you are poorer.
But the point is that I think people maybe instinctively know that they're having a grease-like effect to the NHS, or having it stolen from out from underneath them. Yep. But they don't really care. But it's across every social strata, from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, this also comes down to, when you look at kind of the great victories of neoliberalism, it's breaking down the social structures, the solidarity in terms of things like trade unions, political parties that were used to oppose vested interests and to oppose capital. And so what we're now seeing is obviously a hyper-individualistic society where each person's just stuck with their own struggle. And so that's why you can just dismantle the NHS, and of course through largely the mainstream media, it just hasn't been covered.
The juggernaut that is the privatization of the NHS is finished. There's no turning back. I mean, at this point, the only thing left to do is they're going to raise the price when you at the point of healthcare offering to whatever, 20 or 30 pounds to see a doctor, and then they're going to turn the lights off, and that'll be it. It'll be owned by foreign bankers, and then this country will enter a very, very unhealthy period of disease and illness and death. And it's interesting to talk about, but we're well past the point of return. I don't think there's no saving the NHS at this point. It's gone.
I mean, that's where I'll obviously have to disagree with you, Max. I agree with you insofar as if things continue as they are, absolutely, we are definitely heading down a one-way road of universal private insurance, whatever the government tries to assuage us with. But you know, the NHS is, you know, sacred in Britain. It is the most popular institution, more popular even than the monarchy.
Well, so is Stonehenge.
Yeah.
You know, so is the Druid culture. It's
I
still
think,
sacred in this country, but
Yeah.
they doesn't exist anymore. I don't see many Druids.
No.
But it's still sacred.
Yeah.
Okay, the NHS is dead and buried. It could be sacred, but it's
But you
dead.
know, if you look
It's
at the
dead
other-
as a Druid and Stonehenge. It doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
It's as dead as that king in the parking lot. Dead.
Yeah, but you know, I don't think that's the message we want to get out to our viewers, Max, because
Why?
I think
Shouldn't they
if we
be told the truth, or do we need to mollycoddle them and get their brawly and their wellies and go to, some music festival, Glasgow, and drink? You know, forget them.
No, I
All
mean-
right, well, we got to go. It's a write off the population. No one's going to miss them. Doctor, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Yusuf El Gengi. He's the author of How to Dismantle the NHS in 10 Easy Steps, a very sad story. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.